Good day, everyone. Dale Sanders here. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me. Thanks to our sponsors for this event and supporting this great initiative. It's my honor to be here. I love Alberta. I love the mountains. I love the people, the skiing, the climbing, the backpacking, the hockey. It's a very fond spot in my heart, and it's always a pleasure to spend time with those of you from Alberta as well as others. So we have a pretty dense topic today. In about 20-25 minutes, we're going to go over this notion of finding the balance between protecting patient privacy and leveraging patient data for the common good. That's the theme. Just to be upfront about some of my disclosures and affiliations, I have some financial relationships with the companies listed there. I have non-financial relationships with the organizations listed below. I've done my very best to be as transparent and honest and unbiased with any of my thoughts and opinions today to avoid any kind of conflicts of interest. So the storyline today kind of comes in four parts. I'll share some guiding principles and observations from my 37-year career as a data and decision strategist. We'll talk about healthcare data and sort of the current state of affairs with healthcare data, especially from a US perspective. We'll talk about techniques for privatizing, also known as anonymizing data. And then finally, we'll fly by the models for valuing and monetizing data. My introduction to data sharing came in a very intense way. Way back in 1983, I was a young Air Force officer, and my official title was Command, Control, Communications, Intelligence Officer in the US Air Force. A big part of my job was involved with intelligence data collection, and I was a part of, and our organization was a part of the Five Eyes Intelligence Network, which is an international agreement between Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the US, and the United Kingdom to share very sensitive national intelligence information. And so it's a classic example, I believe, in balancing this notion of individual privacy while at the same time providing for the common good. And ultimately, it rolls up to some level of trust that we place in our governments to process this data in a way that maintains our privacy, but also ensures the safety of our societies. That's when I really became familiar with this tension between privacy and common good. And that's been repeating itself throughout my career. This slide, we could probably spend 20 minutes just on this slide. And I would say that any of my success as a data strategist has more to do with my realization of these issues than it does anything technical. So it's a bit philosophical, but they have an odd and critical relationship to data. So let's start at the top. I'm a firm believer in mindset, skill set, and tool set in that order, as opposed to many times when undertaking data-related initiatives, especially in healthcare, we assume that the tool set should come first, and we invest a lot of time and money in technology and tools. I'm a firm believer that you have to establish the mindset for becoming a data-driven, data-sharing culture. You have to build the skills around the utilization of that data, and then finally invest in tools and technology in that order. Mastery, autonomy, and purpose is what drives human behavior, thanks to Daniel Pink and his books for his influence in raising this awareness to me. If you aren't satisfying people's fundamental need for mastery, autonomy, and purpose with the data that you are aggregating, analyzing, and returning back to those people, your strategy for data will likely suffer significantly. So as a part of every data strategy that I engage in, I step back and ask myself, as a data strategist, to what degree am I satisfying the constituents that I serve and their mastery, autonomy, and purpose in life? Mastering a skill, essentially leaving them alone, letting them be autonomous, keep them in a nurturing environment, but don't micromanage, and then making them feel like they're a part of a larger purpose in life. And I can go on for a long time about how I think in the US, the way we deliver data back to physicians, we are absolutely stripping them of their sense of mastery, autonomy, and purpose. The third bullet there is believability, relatability, and credibility. So anytime you're engaging with another human being in any kind of negotiations, change management, sensitive discussions, those folks on the other side of the table need to believe that you're honest and transparent, trustworthy, and you have their interests in mind as much as you have your own interests in mind. Second, they have to find some way to relate to you, even if it's as just a simple way, like you went to the same college, for example. You grew up in the same town, in the same state. Relatability is super, super important to build relationships. So finding a way to relate to another human being is critically important in data strategies. That's why physicians like to interact with physicians when it comes to data. That's why nurses like to interact with nurses. So finding common ground for relatability is super important. Finally, you have to establish a degree of credibility. So the people that you're working with have to see you as believable, relatable, and also having expertise that they need and value that you hold. So your credibility is super important in those kind of relationships. Fourth bullet is chronic constructive dissatisfaction. When people ask me, what did you do last week? I never have a good answer because I can't remember what I did. All I can ever remember is what's on my to-do list for next week. And I mention this because I think it's super important, especially in the data world of healthcare, where the quality of our data is less than what it should be. We need to be constructive in our journey towards improving data, but we also have to be dissatisfied and constantly moving forward. And what I see is extremes of behavior, especially from leadership, chronic optimism or chronic pessimism about data. And either one of those extremes will lead to failure. So I'm a realist at heart, and I try to practice optimism when it's appropriate, pessimism when it's appropriate, and chronic constructive dissatisfaction consistently. Finally, this is my life motto, the last bullet here: find the truth, tell the truth, and face the truth. I have a philosophy minor, and I credit my philosophy professors for helping me understand the importance of this in life. But what began as a personal motto to find the truth in myself, tell the truth about who I am to myself, and face the truth about who I am, I strongly believe that you advocate this when you're pursuing the truth in data. Data is always a shadowy version of the truth, no matter what. Especially in healthcare, it's a very shadowy version of the truth. So the degree that you can find the truth and rest upon what you think is as you can in data, then telling the truth to the constituents that you support in a way that recognizes there are probably flaws in the data, and then finally helping them face the truth if sometimes that truth is uncomfortable in data. Super, super important to address all three of those as a data strategist. So as I mentioned, we could go on forever about these, but these are really important philosophical aspects of becoming and functioning as a data strategist. There's this notion that, data is the new oil, right? It's kind of a common metaphor. And I think it's particularly important in the Albertan culture. But I would suggest that data might even be better than oil, right? It's a renewable and reusable resource. There will never be a shortage of it. Data is a raw material that has nothing to do with geographic fate. Everyone does and can produce data and can refine it. And in some ways, data and oil are similar, right? Raw data is like unrefined oil. It's becoming a bit of a commodity. So it's what you do with data, the refining, which adds value. And the higher the quality of crude oil and data, the more valuable. So focusing on the quality of the data that you are extracting from the ecosystem is super important. So let's talk about healthcare data and kind of the current state of affairs. Data volume is key to artificial intelligence. That's a really important concept. There was a paper that came out, I believe, in 2009. It's still a very relevant paper, even though it's a bit dated now, published in IEEE. And the title of that paper was The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Data. And it was attempting to satisfy this debate in the AI community. Could sophisticated algorithms compensate for a lack of data volume? And the mathematicians would say, yes, we can produce these sophisticated algorithms that can overcome a lack of data. And of course, the data strategists would say, no, that's impossible, right? You have to have data. Well, after a very thorough analysis in this paper, the conclusion was that invariably simple models and a lot of data trump more elaborate models based on less data. So data volume is very important. More data equals better value from artificial intelligence. So the full potential of AI in healthcare will not be realized unless we collect, share, and aggregate more healthcare-related data. Volume matters. I use automotive and other industries as role models for us. It's interesting, right? What Tesla is doing with data is pretty incredible. So every 10 hours, Tesla collects 1 million miles equivalent of driving data. And they analyze that in aggregate to understand the performance of cars and drivers, where those cars are going, how fast, how often. There's my little cartoon about Elon Musk uploading data to the Tesla cloud. And of course, his statement here about the importance of data also applies to the health of a human being. It applies to the health of that car, but we could easily say the same thing about humans here. We can improve performance, fix problems, and increase safety before you know you need it. That's the goal that we should have with collecting data about patients as well. But we need to step up our digital game a bit. Aviation is another good example of a very forward-thinking industry. Back in the early 90s, the industry got together and said, we need to become digitized. We're going to compete in other areas, but we're going to establish standards for digitization of the aviation industry, all the way from, ticketing up to the performance of a jet engine. And these new generation aircraft now collect 5 to 8 terabytes of data per flight. So remember that, and I'll contrast that to how much data we collect on patients. Modern airlines like the 787 and the A350 collect 10,000 times more data than 1990s or early 2000 era aircraft. And so I really believe if we want to truly embrace the digitization of healthcare, we should set a goal to have 10,000 times more data per patient per year in 5 years. If I were the head of Health and Human Services in the US, this would be one of my stated goals about the digitization of healthcare. Instead, what we've done in the US is we've digitized an outdated paper record. We haven't digitized the patient, we've digitized the process of billing and reimbursement in the US. It's a tragedy. So I, half joking, full truth here, draw parallels to what I call Freudian data envy in healthcare. And that is, our data is a lot smaller than we think it is. And I know these numbers, pretty intimately. We only collect 100 megabytes of data per person per year, per patient per year. And this does not include imagery data. Imagery data kind of skews the results. This is other analytically valuable data other than imagery. So 100 megabytes per year. If you do your math, right, 30 terabytes in 8 hours for an automotive car in Tesla, 5 to 8 terabytes per 4-hour flight. So we barely understand patients. And of course, I use this to highlight that. And so our digital understanding of patients is very, very poor. This is my life and our family on the left. And this is healthcare's digital view of my life on the right. It's highly, highly pixelated. And so I've used this cartoon for gosh, I don't know, I think I drew this maybe in 2008, maybe 2007. And it represents all these sort of categories of data that we need to fully understand the patient at the center. And I would argue that we can turn this into a strategic data acquisition roadmap, right? So take these bubbles, peel them off of the cartoon, put them on a timeline, and establish strategic data acquisition plans. If we're really, really sincere about understanding the patient at the center, we would go after this data for their benefit and for their analysis. In the US, we're largely trapped down here in the lower left corner with healthcare encounter and claims data. We're starting to make progress with biometric data, almost no progress with patient-reported outcomes. Consumer data is a very touchy subject. I don't know that we'll ever go there. We'll see. Socioeconomic data almost completely missing. We're making some progress with genomics, essentially no progress with epigenetic and microbiome data about the patient. But I can imagine laying this down on a timeline that might go out 5 or 10 years, right? But deliberately going after these data sources and including building out the technology required to collect the data. So it's an economic stimulus as well. And I would note that we collect almost no data on healthy patients who rarely visit the healthcare system. That's me. I'm very lucky. Intermountain Healthcare in Salt Lake City has almost no data on me. And of course, those folks who cannot access the healthcare system for various socioeconomic reasons also have no data profile in healthcare. And that's not the way to understand the patient at the center, friends. Okay, so the interesting thing about COVID is that it accelerated the digitization of society, right? We're all a lot more digital than we used to be. I would argue that we're all kind of, pseudo digital strategists and epidemiologists to some degree. So we're a lot more data literate than we were a year ago. But the sad part is it's also widening the socioeconomic digital divide. And I mentioned this report that came out just a couple of weeks ago, that in Silicon Valley, where you would think it's the most digital community in the world, 36% of Latino and 47% of Black families lack access to broadband internet. They're being left behind. So the interesting thing that this socioeconomic data gap creates is this negative feedback loop of biases in analytics and AI. These folks are, for the most part, being left out of the algorithms of analytics and artificial intelligence. So again, we're putting significant shadows around the truth of healthcare and patient populations, especially in the US. This is a great paper from the Brookings Institute in the US. They're sort of this independent government think tank. And I would argue that we must give people the opportunity to participate in the digital world, generate their data plume, then give them the right to share or not share their data. But right now, there is no data. There is this data inequity. They don't even have the opportunity to say whether they want to opt in or opt out in the data economy. So closing the digital divide and digital inequity gap should be a joint priority for government and business. And this paper does a good job of describing how to create a digital equity office, both in corporations as well as in the government. Okay, let's talk a little bit about options for privatizing data. There's basically two simple approaches. I mean, they're technically fairly complicated, but there are really only two substantial options here. And I might add, in this whole notion of privatizing data, I worked for 6 years with the National Security Agency in the US. So you might think that I'd be the most paranoid person in the room when it came to data privacy and that kind of thing. But what that experience at NSA taught me was this gap between real and perceived risk is significant. It's commonly very big. We put too much perceived risk on what amounts to low risk situations, and we tend to ignore higher risk because the perception of that higher risk is distorted. So I would suggest, is it possible to re-identify anonymized data? You bet, absolutely it is. Is it probable? No, for the most part it's not. And the reason is for this fault tree that I sketched over here. To re-identify data, the hacker, the nefarious agent, needs the access, the skills, and the motivation to fire that AND gate. And it's easy to mitigate, especially access. Now, they can build skills, although the skills to re-identify data are not easy. They're pretty sophisticated skills. And then, of course, motivation is something that we can't really control. But we can mitigate this scenario and this AND gate from firing by doing things in the access realm that makes it possible to leverage data, keep it private, and make it available for the common good. Tokenization is one technique for privatizing data, and I'll just read verbatim here. It's the process of substituting a sensitive data element with a non-sensitive equivalent, referred to as a token. That's the token in the middle of this transaction right here. That has no extrinsic or exploitable meaning or value. The token is a reference that maps back to the sensitive data through a tokenization system. So the tokenized data exists over here on this side. The real data is over here on this side of the transaction. Tokenization is widely used right now worldwide as a way to privatize data. There's another technique that I'm particularly fond of, and it's what are known as differential privacy algorithms. And that is, you have your original identifiable data set. And then through the introduction of these transformation algorithms, you can introduce noise in the data that offsets the reality of the data, but doesn't change the analytic behavior. So the data analyzes the same over here on the transformed side of the transaction, but you're protecting the identifiable data and the privacy over here on the left. This is a form of synthetic data. So there's this big topic of data synthesis and synthetic data. Differential privacy algorithms are one of those. I might add here that there are essentially two architectural options for creating a data platform. And this, again, worthy of much longer discussions. But the bottom line is, and the two options, there's a physically integrated and harmonized data warehouse versus federated analytics and virtual data warehouse. You can run analytics and you can hit some degree of accuracy, precision with a federated model, but you're not going to be nearly as accurate and precise as a physically integrated and harmonized data warehouse. Again, more topic discussion to follow on that, probably offline. It's a pretty complex topic. All right, let's talk about monetizing data. What are the basic models? And I just might mention that the data monetization horse left the barn decades ago. So it's not a question of whether to participate, but how, and to do it ethically. There are basically three models for monetizing data. You can provide data as a service, which essentially you're just pushing data downstream to other market analysis functions. Reporting as a service, and you're providing aggregated, anonymized data bundled with basic reporting that serves needs of a broad client base, little or no customization. And then finally, there's analytics as a service, and that is when you're taking the data, customized AI and analytics, and you're making it very specific to an audience or a market, and you're bundling that with professional services. Those are the three basic models for monetizing data. If you're not familiar with this app called DigiMe, I would suggest you check it out. It's a very cool concept. It's basically your own personal data warehouse. You can share your data in exchange for value services with companies. I would also say it's interesting but not yet quite compelling, but something like this is in the future of monetization of data. One of the dreams that I've had for many years is the free or reduced healthcare expenses or taxes in return for a patient's willingness to contribute and share their data. Provide patients a data dividend, if you will. And I would argue that sharing data is a bit like donating blood. It can literally save lives. How do you calculate the value of data? I'd say nobody really knows. Is it cost of production plus margin? What about total market value? There's no real science to it yet. I would also suggest that, beware of the Silicon Valley, Wall Street Journal, and venture capital tendency to overhype the value of big data technology and companies. There's the pump and dump culture, and I'm a part of it, right? I'm in the VC private equity world, so I see it firsthand. There's a lot of hype around this right now, so just be cautious not to get sucked up into that hype. and the pump and dump culture. Here's some recent proxies for data value. You know, Microsoft purchased LinkedIn a few years ago. It amounted to $60 per user. Roche purchased Flatiron a couple of years ago. They paid a premium at $952 per patient record. Facebook and WhatsApp. Facebook paid $48 per user. The IBM Truven deal a few years ago, they ended up at $13 per patient record. A company that I used to be affiliated with many, many years ago, Experian, generates about $17 per consumer record per year. So that's about $5.2 billion they make every year. And then a recent deal that I was involved in, a clinical research organization, is willing to pay $3.5 million per year per patient registry for about 100,000 patients. That amounts to about $35 per patient per year in a registry. Factors that impact data value include volume of records, market demand divided by competitors. Is it anonymized or attributable? What's the data quality? What's the computability of the data? Some data is easier to compute than others, and the historical range of the data. So wrapping up, you know, data sharing across the healthcare data ecosystem is fundamentally important to improving health outcomes and reducing costs. Our digital understanding of patients is very poor. Let's be bold like other industries. Maintain and affordably and reliably. And monetization of data has been going on for decades. Calculating the market value is still hard, but we can do it. And I want to give a shout out to a dear friend of mine. Alberta has a world-class data strategy among you. His name is Stafford Dean. He works at Alberta Health Services. And Stafford is, in my 37 years, the best, most talented data strategist I've ever worked with. So as you go forward with your strategy, I would highly advocate you leverage Stafford's unique expertise. Thanks, everyone. I think we've run up against our time, and it's been great spending time with all of you. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have any questions or anything. Thank you, Shannon. I'll turn things back over to you.